Hello? Welcome. What a nice full room. We're just about to start. Hi, I'm Ariel Zeitlin, and I'm the programming librarian for the Montclair Public Library. Welcome to our Open Book, Open Mind conversation series, which features top authors and thinkers on the important issues of our time. The series is generously sponsored by the Montclair Foundation, Investors Foundation, and the Montclair Public Library Foundation. There's an emergency exit just in the back, and there are restrooms back through the corridor. And now we'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones if you would. After the program, we hope you'll consider visiting Watchung booksellers in the lobby. They'll be selling copies of the book for Charlotte to sign. And we hope to see you again next Sunday on March 1st at 4 p.m. for the next Open Book, Open Mind conversation, this time with columnist Gail Collins and journalist and author Dale Russakoff, who will be discussing Gail's new book, No Stopping Us Now, The Adventures of Older Women in American History. The program is already sold out, but we'll be taking a waiting list on the day of the event. And now, I'm very happy to introduce David Jones, co-founder of Open Book, Open Mind, and a former member of the board of directors for the Montclair Public Library Foundation, who continues to give so generously of his time and energy to keep this wonderful series going strong at our library. Let's all welcome Dave Jones.
Thanks, Ariel, and welcome this afternoon to hear Charlotte, and welcome her back to Montclair. The ones we've been waiting for defines the class of young leaders who are remaking the nation, how grappling with 9/11 as teens, serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, occupying Wall Street, and protesting with Black Lives Matter, and shouldering their way into a financially rigged political system has shaped the people who will govern America's future. The New York Times has mentioned this book as being a timely account of how this generation will wield power to change America when it fully acquires that power, and it's the question that Charlotte sets out to answer in the ones we've been waiting for. The Times said she does an excellent job detailing with persuasive data what has shaped and motivated this younger generation so far. Charlotte is a national correspondent for Time magazine, covering politics and social issues. She went to the Montclair Public Schools for elementary school and then graduated from Newark Academy in 2007 and from Harvard College in 2012. She's covered the 2016, 18, and 20 political campaigns for Time, the Women's March, the anti-Trump resistance, and the rise in activism around gun violence and climate change. Her coverage often has a special focus on women in politics, social movements, and youth activism. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Charlotte will be in conversation this afternoon with Julian Lucas, a writer and critic who was born in Montclair and grew up here. He's now based in Brooklyn. He graduated from Montclair High School in 2011, Harvard College in 2015. He's an associate editor at Cabinet, which is an arts and culture magazine, and a contributing editor at The Point, which is a literary magazine. His essays and criticism have appeared in the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, Harper's, and the New York Times, where he is a contributing writer to the Book Review. He's currently writing a history of Underground Railroad reenactments. Also, Charlotte will be returning to the library on March 28th for a panel discussion at the Montclair Literary Festival about the leadership and political currents shaping the future of American government. Let's give a warm welcome and welcome home Charlotte and Julian.
Look at this crowd.
Okay, so let's get started. First of all, Charlotte, congratulations to you on the release of this book. I think there's been just so much discussion of the millennial generation, listicles, sociological studies, et cetera, and I think what you've really done is given a compelling narrative of our generation through some young politicians. So thank you for doing that service.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with a question.
Do you want some water?
I would love some water. Getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're both a little parched.
Yes. So I wanted to start with a question about the formation of this generation. So in the very beginning of your book, you discuss studies to the effect that what really shapes the political ideology of a generation is what happens in the youth of that generation. And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about what the major events you selected were and how they shaped the millennial generation.
Yeah, so I think there's often this misconception that young people are always liberal and older people are always conservative, and that as people grow up, they become more conservative. And what these studies have shown is that that might be true a little bit around the edges, around things like property taxes and education policy and small things that might affect, your kids start going to school, so suddenly you might care a little bit more about education as an issue than you did before. But broadly, your core political identity is largely shaped by the historical events that happen in your life around the time that you come into political awareness, which is usually like 18 through like your mid-20s, like 18 through 26 or 28. And so once I learned that, I was kind of interested in looking at the events that have shaped how millennials think about politics, which is the subject of this book. So I started at 9/11 because for many millennials, that was a moment kind of similar to what the assassination of JFK was for boomers. It was this formative moment, and so much of the way we saw the world was defined by like before 9/11 or after 9/11. So essentially what this book does is it traces these characters through, actually to answer your question better, I began to think to myself, what are these events that might have shaped this cohort? And so 9/11 was an obvious one. The wars that followed, which went on forever and seemed pointless and often seemed like they were based on, if not outright lies, then mistakes. The financial crisis that really affected the way so many young people were able to afford life. Obama's election, which was totally transformative for many of the young people who supported him. And then Trump's election, which is really the event that kind of kickstarted this political revolution, because it wasn't until Trump got elected that many of these young people thought to themselves, listen, if this guy could do it, we can do it too. Does that answer your question?
It absolutely does. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of this book is, politicians always kind of present themselves ready-made to the world. And what you've done through the portraits in the book is you show how these people became politicians, how their worldviews were shaped, sometimes down to what were they doing in high school and what happened on their tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm wondering, first of all, how did you kind of pick your cast? And maybe if you could mention who some of those people are. That we have Pete Buttigieg and AOC, but you also have some lesser known figures. So how did you kind of pick your cast, and then how did you get them to open up about their lives in this way?
So I picked the cast. I was looking for specifically people who, I had a couple criteria. They had to be born between 1980 and 1996. And millennials, according to Pew, actually start in 1981. but I made a little adjustment because this guy, Carlos Curbelo, who is a millennial-ish Republican, was somebody that I really wanted to include because his story is really emblematic of what has happened in the Republican Party. And I think that that's kind of what I was looking for with these characters, is that I wanted people whose lives had intersected in a meaningful way with some of these big events that I just described. So somebody who served in the war in Iraq, or somebody whose family almost lost their home in the financial crisis, or somebody whose experience with student debt has shaped their whole life, or somebody who worked on the Obama campaign, or somebody who really organized in the resistance to Trump. And I wasn't interested in people who kind of had just like gone to college, gone to law school, clerked for a judge, and then decided to run for state senate. Like people who seem to be on just a strict trajectory, untouched by the events around them. Obviously, racial and gender diversity was extremely important in casting this because I wanted to make sure that it was reflective. And I also wanted to include some Republicans because it's just not true that all millennials are Democrats. Millennials definitely lean to the left, but it's not 100%. There are certainly some young Republicans, and I wanted to make sure that this book reflected that. Getting them to, and each one of these people presented different challenges. So I first started talking to Pete Buttigieg for this book in 2017 when I was writing a story for Time about millennial mayors. And actually, that story was in a lot of ways the seed of this book, because I saw that this whole book started because Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, and I went nuts. And when that happened, I began to Google around and to look at, I knew that Trump was the oldest first-term president, but then when I looked around at the people who were encouraging him to leave the Paris Climate Agreement, they were these guys in their 70s and 80s. And then when I looked at all of the other things that the Trump administration was doing, from canceling DACA to banning transgender troops from the military, to rolling back protections against predatory student loan providers. All of these things seemed like evidence, or seemed like we were in a generational war and that the old were eating the young. And then I began to look at, and so I was kind of like, okay, well, who are the young people who are stepping up? And at that point, in 2017, there weren't yet a lot of young people who were running for Congress or running for president or any of that. So there were young people who were mayors of these towns. And so I met Pete first in 2017 when he was mayor of South Bend for that story. But some of the other people were people that I just kind of like heard that there was an interesting young woman who was running for Congress in Michigan, and I went and talked to her, and it was before she won her primary, so she didn't have a press person yet. And that's the key.
So she was totally vulnerable.
Yes, she was prey. No, no, but it is true that it is much, much, much harder to get people to open up to you when they're already, running for president, right, or when they're already, serving in the House of Representatives, because they're much, much, much more closed off. So Haley Stevens is a great example of this. Haley Stevens is one of my characters who is the Democratic representative for Michigan's 11th district, and she'll never let you forget it. She is this she's got this like great Michigan accent. She talks like this. She says, "Nice to meet ya." She's she's got such a great personality. She's just like really fun and bubbly. And she was running for her seat, and I said, "Hey, can we talk? Can I interview you for this book?" She was like, "Sure." And I showed up at her house, and her mom was there. Her mom is a painter, and what she likes to paint are rat skeletons on black backgrounds. So there was a whole big cabinet full of rat skeletons, which was interesting.
Why isn't this in here?
I did have a whole section about, is her mom a witch? I don't know. And then I cut it for space. I should have put it in there, but
It's the behind the scenes.
I know, behind the scenes. But we were talking, and I said, "Oh, what was it like for you? You know, when did you get your first cell phone? What was your first screen name?" And she said, "Oh, let me check." And she pulls out this big box of her journals from childhood, and she starts going through them. And I said, "Can I look?" And she said, "Sure." And then, so it's like, if you're running for Congress, you are not supposed to let a journalist read your journals. But there was nobody there to tell her that. And it was fine. And like, she's very happy with the book. It's not like I've revealed any secrets that she didn't know that she was sharing. But you know, if you go to a sitting member of Congress, they would never, ever, ever let you read their childhood journals in a million years.
And maybe there's a generational component to that as well.
It could be that there's an oversharing.
And I mean, another one of the strongest chapters in your book is on AOC, you know, kind of before her election, when she was still working as a bartender, and she went to Standing Rock to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. And you found some videos you were mentioning.
So AOC was actually a big problem for this book because I didn't get to her early. I was sort of following her race, but she's not somebody that I kind of started interviewing way before she won. I was a little bit late to her. And I did get to interview her, but she'd already been elected by the time I met her. But one thing that was really the best day of the reporting of this book was the day that I found AOC's personal Facebook page, which is not under her real name, it's under like a slightly adjusted name. And on that Facebook page were hours and hours of live video footage of her trip to Standing Rock, her trip to the Women's March, and the first few days of her running for office with Justice Democrats. And the reason that was so helpful was that if I had just said to her, "Hey, you know, tell me about Standing Rock, what was that like?" She would have, you know, no matter how candid she wanted to be, even if she didn't want to hold anything back, she was never going to remember every single detail about that trip. But I was very lucky that the exact period of time I was looking at was also the exact period of time that Facebook happened to be encouraging people to use Facebook Live rather than Instagram stories, which is what people use now, and those automatically disappear. So Facebook Lives are saved forever unless you delete them or you choose to delete them. And so I was able to find this live video of exactly the period that I was looking at and write the chapter based off of that evidence or that material, and it just was a complete game changer. And it's something that I think moving forward is going to be like crucial to covering the millennial generation, is just how much material is out there on social media about our lives, just for anybody to find.
Right. And in that section, I mean, it's kind of great that she did those videos when she did, because something you convey is that this is really when she was beginning to see herself as a politician. Like you mentioned, that there are kind of moments in individual videos, like she's at the Jefferson Memorial with some friends kind of discussing the Constitution and American ideals, and you describe this moment where she kind of switches into seeing herself more as a politician. Right.
There's a moment where she's at the Jefferson Memorial, and listen, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez circa 2020 would never praise slave-owning Thomas Jefferson. That is very not okay to do in our progressive climate, especially for a progressive woman of color icon in the way that she is. But she's at the Jefferson Memorial the day after the Women's March with her friend, the same friend that she went to Standing Rock with, who talked to me a lot for this book. And she kind of talks about how much she admires Thomas Jefferson, even though she knows he owned slaves. She acknowledges that he owned slaves. But she talks about how much she admires him as a founding father and as a thinker, and particularly how Thomas Jefferson outlined a vision of democracy that would be replenishable and that would change with the generations. And that was something that in particular she admired about him. And it was just really interesting to watch her kind of vocalize ideas that I know she would never say now.
Right.
Because,
kind of, yeah. Just when she was in formation.
Exactly.
And another another aspect of your book that's so interesting is that, so we just talked about Haley Stevens and AOC, two very different politicians. And you look at a lot of people who came up working in the Obama administration. You have Lauren Underwood, who worked in the Department of Health and Human Services, and you have Stevens, who worked on the auto rescue. And then you have people who came to politics through activism. And I think one of the most interesting theses of your book is that the politicians have had to become activists, and the activists have had to go into electoral politics in a way that maybe wouldn't have happened in another generation. And I just wondered, do you think that's something that's kind of unique to the millennial generation, and how well do you think this is going on both sides?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's unique to the millennial generation, because I didn't, I only had 2 years to write this, so I wasn't able to really do like a deep comparison into, comparing it to boomer activists and their, level of engagement with electoral politics. But it is definitely, movement politics is absolutely defining everything in the Democratic Party right now. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, who's now the Democratic frontrunner. And in a lot of ways, this book, and I think a lot of what is happening right now with millennial politics, is also about Obama's legacy, which is more complicated than originally anybody thought it would be. Because while Obama is still, absolutely the most popular president for this generation, and revered and beloved and iconic in all the ways that he was when he was president, for a lot of millennials, particularly on the left, there was something incomplete about his presidency. He was a personally transformative figure, but many of them felt that there wasn't enough systemic change under his administration, and they were frustrated that that bankers got away with what they got away with during the financial crisis, and that income inequality persisted over the course of his presidency, and that he could have used the response to the financial crisis to fundamentally change the economy, right. And he just staunched the bleeding and didn't like fundamentally change the underlying infrastructure of how money moves within our system. And I think that a lot of people were really frustrated by that, and that's what Occupy Wall Street was. And you can draw a direct line from Occupy to Bernie 2016 to AOC 2018 to Bernie 2020. But I also think, maybe more importantly, a lot of millennials saw, that even under the first black president, an incredibly inspirational figure, young black men were still being shot in the street with impunity. So this idea that, the election of the first black president didn't actually tangibly cure or heal structural racism in as much as people might have expected it would, led to Black Lives Matter. And it was this idea that if this, charismatic, wonderful black president can't change the systemic inequality in this country, then maybe it's beyond the scope of one person's ability to change. And if somebody like Barack Obama can't fix it, then maybe no one person can fix it. And that's why this book is called The Ones We've Been Waiting For, because I really wanted to put the emphasis on the plurality of ones. That it's not about electing one person president or another one person president or making sure this one person gets to the Senate. It's about a holistic, broader movement of many people acting at once, many individual transformations that collectively amount to a broader political transformation.
Right. If we could go back to, you were talking about Black Lives Matter in the Obama administration, and I think what you were discussing is so vividly captured in one of your portraits of Braxton Winston in North Carolina. And you write about the fact that he literally built a stage that Obama spoke on. That was kind of his day job. But then he became known as a Black Lives Matter activist. And you write very vividly about the fact that he went from being an activist to being elected to city council, and he went from someone who was protesting the police to someone who actually was in a supervisory role over the police. What was it like looking at kind of activist figures like that and their kind of first moments in power? I mean, I think your portrait of AOC has a kind of similar narrative.
Yeah, so one thing that I found that was a little bit surprising, frankly, is that, so Braxton is a city council member in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he became involved with Black Lives Matter after the killing of Keith Lamont Scott in 2017. Or was it 2016? I'm sorry, I forgot the exact date. I think it was 2017. And he's another one where his Facebook videos helped me write that chapter because he had taped his experiences on the nights that he was out protesting the police. He had them all on video. So I didn't have to like kind of piece it together from newspaper clippings or his recollections or other people's recollections because it was there. But one thing that I noticed in reporting this book is that I really was looking for that character. I was looking for somebody who was a Black Lives Matter activist who had gone into electoral politics. And that actually there were fewer than I had thought there would be. And so that is one, you know, Braxton was a great example, but I wish that there had been 15 examples of people to choose from. And so I think that that's one of the things that's still being negotiated for these young leaders is the extent to which, you know, a lot of people turn to activism because they think the electoral system is so fundamentally broken that it's not worth engaging in that avenue. And a lot of people turn to electoral politics because they don't have that activist gene of like, you know, break stuff up and, you know, mess things up and like shake up the system and make it wake people up. So in some ways you're talking about two fundamentally different like styles of personality. Mm-hmm. And I think you see that right now with Pete Buttigieg and with AOC because Pete is so unactivist to his core. He just doesn't have that gene. He doesn't like conflict. He's not confrontational. He's very like cerebral. He likes to think through problems. He likes to bring everyone to the table and come to a solution. And AOC is basically an activist who happens to have a congressional pin and be elected. And her whole theory of change is rooted in, you know, change the parameters of debate, change what is thought of as possible, change hearts and minds, and less rooted in getting an actual piece of legislation through. And so in some ways, the fact that they are the two most visible millennial politicians right now really illustrates how those two different modes are like kind of working against each other.
Right. You end with a very optimistic vision of those two kind of strands of this like progressive politics is a kind of double helix, like the structure of DNA, and there's the activist wing, and then there's the people who came up working in campaigns and as aides. Do you think that's going to hold together?
I don't know. I mean, I do think that there are basically two different takeaways from the Obama years. One is fix the system, work within the system, get a couple doubles, a couple triples, a couple singles, try to move the ball a little bit. The other is the system is so broken that we need to burn it all down and build a new system in its place. And I think in a lot of ways this election is a negotiation between those two ideas. But I also think that the reason I'm optimistic is that those two attitudes have more in common than they do. Like, they're ultimately, let me think of the right way to phrase this. Ultimately, they agree on more than they disagree on. They agree on where they're trying to go. They want universal health care. They want urgent action on climate change. They want the government to build a stronger social safety net for people who need it. They want racial equality. They just disagree on like the right ways to get there. And a lot of the roadblocks, the reason I'm optimistic is that a lot of the roadblocks to those things are coming from an older generation
Right.
of Republicans who are in their 70s and even 80s at this point, where they might not necessarily have to deal with as many of those roadblocks for as long as they have been dealing with them, if
Right.
that makes sense. And listen, there are plenty of young Republicans who disagree with them fundamentally on a lot of these things, but there are also a lot of places where young Republicans and young Democrats can find common ground where older Republicans were never going to get there.
I'm glad you brought up the young Republicans because that section was something where I learned a lot that I did not know. I did not know about the Young Republican Climate Caucus that Carlos Curbelo and Elise Stefanik and others were more aligned with the left on climate change. But at the same time, some of those candidates, with the younger candidates in the Republican Party, younger elected officials, have ended up having to bend to some of those older voters. So do you see any chance for millennials to change the Republican Party?
I think one of the great unrecognized of the many things that Trump has destroyed, the ability of young Republicans to bring their party into the 21st century is one that's gone kind of unrecognized. Because during the Obama administration, there were young Republicans who were getting elected who had very different politics than Obama, very different from Pete, very different from AOC. They're conservatives, but they believed that climate change was happening. They believed it was a huge threat to national security, and they believed the government had to do something about it. They were done fighting on gay marriage. They weren't interested in relitigating any of the sort of Christian right moral questions of what is a family, and they were kind of like marriage equality is fine. They believed in, a lot of them supported marijuana legalization. A lot of them, Carlos Curbelo in particular, were very pro-immigrant because they wanted the Republican Party to be the party of immigrants, and they saw an opening to really get the Latino vote into the Republican Party, and they were like, so they had all these ideas for making the Republican Party more tolerant and more diverse and more welcoming to young people. And a lot of those ideas were laid out in that infamous GOP autopsy in 2013. And that autopsy, what I say in the book, is that it was totally right. It's just that its timing was off, and it didn't predict Trump. But all of the trends that the GOP laid out in that autopsy are absolutely accurate, and they're in big trouble if they don't address them. But Trump kind of gave them like one last taste of victory, basically. And what I lay out in the book is that, young Republicans were kind of on their way to really modernizing the party, and then Trump happened. And then once Trump happened, these young Republicans were put in this position of having to either defend him, which Dan Crenshaw does, sort of defect from the party altogether, which is what Justin Amash has done, and it hasn't worked out so great for him. Sort of try to distance themselves from Trump a little bit and say he's good sometimes, but not good other times. I don't agree with him all the time. And that's what Elise Stefanik spent a really long time trying to do until the last couple months, where she's taken a hard right turn and is now a defender of Donald Trump, as we saw in the impeachment hearings. Or you could be defeated. And that's what happened to Carlos Curbelo. Because Carlos Curbelo was this young Republican who loudly and often criticized Donald Trump as somebody who was threatening the Republicans' ability to reach young people. And then in 2018, he lost his seat.
Yeah, it seems like older Republicans are not necessarily listening to younger Republicans to the same extent that maybe older Democrats are interested, as evidenced by this book and its success in what younger progressives are saying. So related to that question of the millennial Republicans, you've told a story of rising millennial power, of the first sentence of your book, you're talking about, like it or not, millennials will be in charge. But at the same time, a lot of the politicians in your book end up getting curtailed at a certain point. You you write about AOC's arrival in Congress, and she's saying, we're going to run primary challengers against centrists, we're going to do all of this, but then ultimately she has to kind of reach a détente with Nancy Pelosi.
Right.
The young millennial Republicans, as we just discussed, they didn't do so well there. And even some of the most successful, like Pete Buttigieg, for example, in the last debate was asked, are you out of step with your generation? So I guess my question for you is, when do you think that the millennial base, so to speak, whether that means like millennial power in civil society and in journalism, when do you think that is going to be sufficient that to the point that millennial politicians are responding to millennial needs and values?
Wow, that's such a good question. Truly, I don't know. I don't know when it will happen. And you're totally right that individually, none of these people has had a transformative impact in the way that Obama did, for example, by being elected president. And that's why it's a story of all of them together, because it's not, you can't argue legitimately that, by getting elected to Congress, Haley Stevens, got a STEM education bill through, and that is like the most significant accomplishment of anybody her age, So it is more about, it's less about what these individuals achieve in their political careers, and by the way, I was writing about them in their first year as congressional freshmen when Mitch McConnell has the Senate. Yeah. So it's like they didn't get very much done, but like nobody got very much done, because even veteran lawmakers were not getting anything through Mitch McConnell's Senate, with a couple of exceptions. But I do think it's more about creating, and I think this is already happening in the presidential election, creating a critical mass of people who are taking issues that affect young people really seriously and are seeing many of these issues from the perspectives of these young people, even if they're not themselves young. And understanding that perspective might be different from the 20th century baby boomer perspective, but it's not, just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
And that there needs to be some kind of dialogue between the two that's not just like parents telling their millennial kids to shut up and listen to them because they know better. And in some ways, I think that that's what we are seeing right now with this election between Bernie Sanders and whoever the moderates end up getting behind. I think that young Bernie Sanders supporters are arguing basically that in 2016, older moderates said to the young progressives, listen, we're nominating Hillary Clinton, shut up and get on board, hold your nose and get with her because this is what we're doing. And that didn't work. And so a lot of young progressives are now arguing, okay, we tried it your way and we got Donald Trump. Let's try it our way and see what happens.
Right. I think one of the services your book provides, and also this is one of the best chapter titles, is Harry Potter and the Spawn of the Boomers. And because we are in our shared hometown, the self-declared progressive parenting capital of America, I wonder if you could speak a little to how baby boomers and baby boomer parenting styles, but also baby boomer politics set the stage for the millennial generation.
So I really try hard not to be too tough on boomers in this book.
Better not, they gotta buy it.
As much, even though it seems like that sometimes when I talk about it, this book is not a diatribe against boomers. There is, I do early in this chapter kind of get into, there were a lot of really bad decisions made by the politicians elected by baby boomers and baby boomer politicians themselves. And that basically in the 80s and 90s, you had Reagan on the right, and then Clinton, who was supposed to be the centrist third way moderate Democrat who represented the middle. And even he was pretty conservative compared to where millennials are today. So in some ways what this book is about is like a swing from a paradigm that was like extreme right versus center right to a paradigm that we're seeing now with AOC on the far left and somebody like maybe Pete Buttigieg on the center left. You know, comparing those two centers is the difference between the boomers and the millennials. So comparing a Bill Clinton and a Pete Buttigieg helps you understand what has changed. But what I explore in this particular chapter is the extent to which boomers parented very differently than their parents did in a way that was great. Boomers were really good at raising kids. And yeah, excellent parents. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that in 1981 was the first year that women graduated from college at the same rate that men did, which meant that the kids born in the 80s and then the 90s were much, much more likely than any previous generation to have a college-educated mother as well as a college-educated father. And that meant that there was a tremendous amount of emphasis placed on enrichment and on education, and importantly, baby boomers, you know, were much more likely than their parents to think that all of their kids, girls and boys, deserved an education and would go to college. And that led to a lot of the other things that we saw happen, you know, relating to college affordability and the education system being sort of inaccessible and unaffordable. But it meant that baby boomers were both extremely kind of they were extremely overprotective, but they were also very much about intentional parenting in a way that their parents weren't. In fact, the word parenting wasn't even really a thing that people talked about before the 80s. You know, look at even the culture of that time. It was like Mrs. Doubtfire, parenthood, 3 men and a baby. The genes of that era were called the mom genes. Like, there was so much cultural emphasis put on parenting as a calling.
I love to think of us as the Mrs. Doubtfire.
We are the
generation.
Mrs. Doubtfire generation. And so, and what that had a lot of interesting unintended consequences, having to do with, you know, like so many of the things that I think people attack millennials for, like being snowflakes or being self-centered or being, you know, obsessed with self-confidence. You know, boomers were the first generation to coach their kids in what I call in the book the dubious science of self-esteem. The idea that any problem in your life, if you're bullied, if you're not getting good grades, if you don't make the soccer team, is linked to your self-esteem. That was something that like boomers taught millennials. That wasn't something that millennials invented themselves. And so I think that really shaped how a lot of millennials exist in the world. And it also primed them to be, one other point about this is that this was also around the time that people started being really terrified that their kids would get kidnapped. And you started seeing childhood become increasingly constrained, and playdates had to be chaperoned, and kids couldn't bike around by themselves as much anymore, and you know, everyone had to have permission for everything. And so you had a generation of sort of maybe slightly over-parented, under-endangered children.
Under-endangered. Endanger your children.
Yes, endanger them. Over-parented, under-endangered children started to read about a wizard orphan fighting the forces of death and evil. and Harry Potter became not only just the most popular children's book of that period, but the most popular children's book of all time, a literally unprecedented phenomenon in human history. Harry Potter is more influential. J.K. Rowling is more influential than Charles Dickens in terms of the sheer number of people who have read her work and have read it over and over and over and over and over again. And so I get into kind of how Harry Potter
Right.
has shaped a lot of
And you discussed that, I mean, Harry Potter is very much a story of young people making older people have to be accountable for what's going on in their world, even though no one's told them that's their job. And something else I was fascinated by in your discussion of the way millennials grew up is you talk about kind of zero tolerance policies and bullying, and you draw a connection between that and the kind of emphasis on justice in millennial politics. You talk about things, you know, the so-called cancel culture, for example, and kind of purity tests, but you also draw connections between that and kind of these big historic events, like the fact that our generation is one that is not happy that those who caused the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and those who caused the financial crisis have not been punished for it. And I think that was also kind of one of the reasons there was a generational divide beginning in the Obama administration, is that he did not go after those responsible for that. So I wonder, do you think that is ultimately, speaking to those who are worried about, you know, cancel culture and social justice warriors, do you think that our generational emphasis on justice and accountability is ultimately going to be for the best politically, or a shortcoming?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a shortcoming, but let me explain the cancel culture and zero tolerance policy connection.
Right.
So when we were talking about parenting and overprotective parenting, one thing that started in the 80s and 90s were zero tolerance policies in schools, often pushed for by parents who were really obsessed with their kids. And what zero tolerance policies said was essentially that the essentially normal childhood behavior, like pushing kids on the playground or calling people names, was now categorized as bullying, and there's zero tolerance for bullying. So if you have a kid who's acting out or who's, you know, hitting other kids, in previous generations it would have been just like, oh, that's just a kid, whatever. And for millennials, it was like, you're expelled from school. And this had a particularly harmful impact on Black and brown kids, because they were almost always over-disciplined, and their normal childhood misbehaviors were much more likely to be read as like criminal. And many Black and brown kids got pushed into the criminal justice system through the school to prison pipeline, and like lost humongous opportunities because of that.
Yeah.
And one other unintended consequence of these policies, I argue, is that it created a sense of morality that was sort of unforgiving. This idea that it's like one strike, you're out. You push one kid on the playground, you're gone from school. One fight, you're done. And I think that is something that we see in millennial culture, not only electoral politics, but social and cultural politics as well. And I think one way to think about it is that in some ways, boomers or older generations were over-forgiving. We're too forgiving of people like the people who caused the financial crisis. And you hear older people say, oh, well, that guy was just doing his job. You know, when he was selling crap mortgages to poor people that he knew would explode in their face, that was just his job. What's the problem? You know?
Right.
Or like, oh, like, you know, like what were we supposed to not go to war in Iraq? Like, you know, like, and I think young people hear that and they're like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you know, and so it's almost an overcorrection to the lenience of the previous generation that seems to allow and embrace and kind of accept so much obvious wrongdoing from people. And so I think in some ways millennials are maybe, if boomers are over-forgiving, I think in some ways millennials are a little under-forgiving and a little bit more likely to kind of write someone off for one bad thing that they say, or, you know, cancel somebody for making a bad joke, or, you know, report somebody for behaving in a way that might be possibly considered problematic. And so that is, I think, a big challenge for millennials in creating a movement that's durable and that can handle tension and can handle disagreements and can weather bumps in the road, basically. And it's one reason that Pete Buttigieg is doing so well.
Yeah.
Now, he's not the front runner, but Pete Buttigieg went from being a no-name mayor of Whoville, Indiana, to being really, one of the top-tier presidential contenders in 2 years. And the reason that he was able to do that were a lot of things. He's very politically talented, but his fundamental message is a message of forgiveness. It's a message of, if you voted for Trump, come on back. It's fine. We're not going to spend our time telling you how racist you are. Just come on back. and if you're a anti-choice conservative, come on in. We're not going to lecture you on all the ways you are making women, not letting women have control over their own bodies. And I think for a lot of people, that message of forgiveness is very appealing to them.
Right. Though maybe less so with millennials.
Less so with millennials, because millennials don't like them.
And you mentioned a front runner, and of course I think a lot of people are wondering after Bernie Sanders' victory last night. I think a conversation that's been going on for a while is reaching a new kind of pitch, which is why is there such openness to democratic socialism among millennials?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. The main reason is that, and an important thing to note with this is that when people hear this, they think, oh my God, every millennial's a socialist. Like, there are Bolsheviks in my house. And it's not, that's not what it is. That's not what it is. The actual membership of the Democratic Socialists of America is right now around 35,000 people, which can fit inside Fenway Park, okay? So it's not like every young person who supports Bernie Sanders is a comrade and a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party. What is true is that the concept of socialism has lost its sting. And it's no longer considered to be toxic, because if you think about, again, back to the beginning of our conversation, people's politics are shaped by the events of their early adulthood. The oldest millennials were like 8 or 9 when the Berlin Wall fell, okay? So they have none of the Cold War context for socialism and communism. When they think of the things that have had the worst impact on their lives, they think of these bankers operating with total impunity in a way that absolutely destroyed the economy and any chance they have at a prosperous life, okay? So they think of unchecked capitalism, not creeping socialism, as the thing that is most dangerous to American prosperity. And when they think of socialism, they don't think of like a gulag or bread lines. They think of Sweden, where healthcare is free and you get a year off with your new baby, and there's childcare, clean, well-run childcare centers that operate 24 hours a day that are free and provided by the government so that everyone can have, affordable childcare. So there's just a different context. I have 2 other things to say about this. One is that don't underestimate how much people love to say they're socialists because it pisses off their parents, okay? Like, come on, it's like, so when boomers are like, you're a socialist, it's like, yeah, we just love that. Like, it's the boomer, reaction to it makes it cool.
There's a symbiosis.
It's cool because our parents don't like it. Remember the Beatles? But the other thing that's important to remember about democratic socialism is that operative word is democratic, right? So in many of the worst kind of examples of socialism in the world were totalitarian socialism, where a dictator took over and implemented, really a harsh economic, ruined everything because they were dictators. And the thing about democratic socialism is listen, AOC, if the people in the 14th District of New York decided that AOC's policies were making their taxes too high, or that they didn't like that she was, they didn't like her health care plan, or they didn't like the Green New Deal, they could vote her right out of office. And the same is true with Bernie Sanders. So there's not, you know, it's not a socialist takeover because nobody is going to cancel any elections. And if Bernie Sanders gets elected and taxes go way up and people don't like the health care that he is, you know, constructing, and the Green New Deal seems like it's too expensive and too chaotic, then he'll lose the next election. And like, you know?
Absolutely.
So it's like not so scary.
Yeah. And the emphasis has been as much on democracy. I mean, you write about
Yeah.
the Occupy movement and the way that that brought ideas of kind of direct democracy into our generation's politics.
Right, and to follow up on this exact point, our generation has seen billionaires be the greatest threat to democracy, not socialism.
Yeah.
It's not, it's unchecked corporate campaign contributions that have been the biggest silencer of ordinary Americans. It's not some dictator somewhere who's, you know, shutting down free speech. So I think that that's the big thing to remember, is that this is a generation that saw what happens when unchecked billionaires run rampant over our political process. And that's why I think that's why I think people who think that young people will vote for Mike Bloomberg are
Crazy.
Need to read my book. Yeah.
That's a great answer. I want to ask you one more question
Sure.
before we turn it over to
Sorry,
the
my
audience.
answers have been very long.
No, they've been excellent answers, and I feel like I'm learning even more than, you know. So I wanted to ask you, you were talking about free speech, and in this book you provide biographies of politicians. How did these historical events kind of shape you as a journalist and your approach to writing a book like this?
Well, that's such a good question. I would say that the single, you know, so I have been very fortunate. There are a lot of these things that I've never personally experienced myself. And that's why I didn't write a memoir. But I do think that the level of anger, I do think that one thing I did experience, which I think a lot of people my age have experienced, is that after the 2016 election, it felt like the crumbling of the old order. And with that crumbling was, and among many things that crumbled when Trump was elected, was also this idea that like the people who were relying their assumptions on 20th century realities were out of touch.
Yeah.
And that those paradigms don't hold anymore. Some of them do. It's not like you could just wipe them all away. Obviously, there are major historical lessons to be taken from the past, but so much of the way we all got 2016 so wrong is because the exact same people who were covering the Clintons in the 90s were still covering the Clinton campaign in 2016. And so, like, there was just this accumulation of assumptions and attitudes and things that were like left over from an earlier time. And so I think that I maybe too much am a little bit kind of like let's turn the page. We're 2 decades into a new century. It's time to it's time to like do a harsh reckoning with like what is history and what is something that is like relevant to the politics of today. Because not everything that happened, for example, it frustrates me when people really compare, you know, the 2020 election with 1972. Because, I mean, I'm sure there are legitimate comparisons, and it is important to recognize, particularly when it comes to Bernie Sanders, that his politics did not win a single Republican seat in 2016. All of the Democrats who flipped seats in 2016 were more moderate than Bernie Sanders. So that is a legitimate criticism of the Sanders movement, that they have proven that they can whip up young people and that they can like get people really excited, but they have not proven that they can flip Republican seats. Not even one.
Right.
If there was one that they flipped, I would be like, okay, well, that's evidence. There's not one. So that's a big, that's a big mark against him. But I do find it frustrating when people kind of point to, like, things that happened 50 years ago as evidence for why something can't happen now. And it's like, yeah, but 50 years ago, like, the internet wouldn't have been created for another 30 years. Like, people didn't have cell phones. Like, there were all sorts of reasons that 50 years ago is completely different from today.
And I think one thing you do is just go so deep into the lived experience of this generation and how it shaped the leaders. So it's something that should refresh that conversation and allow us all to have a more productive political conversation. So thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thanks, Julian.
And everyone should read this. It's fantastic. And I think we're going to turn to some audience questions now.
Thank you so much to both of you for this really enlightening and absorbing and wonderful conversation. So, okay, I have my first question.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
One thing I didn't hear you mention, and I'm wondering if because it really doesn't have an impact politically or otherwise, is mass shootings. Did this not have an impact on millennials? And if it did, what was it? And if it didn't, why do you think not?
That's a great question. So in my book, the way it's structured is that every couple chapters there's a page that is about either a mass shooting event or a major climate event like a hurricane. And those the mass shooting events are taken directly from news. They're almost like it's like a word cloud or like a tone poem or something. It's like taken directly from the news reports of those shootings. And the reason I did it that way is because I didn't feel like I could just write a chapter that was like shootings, climate change, because these were events that periodically interrupted the millennial adolescence and young adulthood. It wasn't like there was just one big shooting and that was it. They happened almost every year. Every year there was a huge, horrific mass shooting of some kind. And so it absolutely is something that has very much shaped how young people think about their safety in school, think about government effectiveness, because remember, they know that the vast majority of Americans favor common sense gun reforms. These are the same kids who, it's the older siblings of the kids who were in Parkland, right? And that gets back to the issue of money in politics, right? Because they also, they know that this is happening, that kids are being slaughtered in school. They know that the vast majority of Americans don't want this to happen and that there are common sense solutions that other countries have implemented to prevent this from happening. And they see that the only reason that that's not happening is because the NRA has a stranglehold on the Senate. And so it gets back to this idea that millennials have really internalized that the single biggest problem is that there's too much money in politics. And so I think that many of them think of it not as necessarily a gun issue, but as a money issue, and like who's paying whom. And that's one reason why so many of them are kind of more like why so many of them root their analysis in this idea of getting big money out of politics. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Charlotte. I just wanted to say, first of all, somebody tweeted when the Parkland kids had their Stop the Madness rally that those kids and their activism is Obama's legacy. Mm-hmm. I also want to ask you, you talked about the millennials being unforgiven, and one thing that's obsessed me is when Al Franken got into trouble, a lot of people, I thought this was a terrific liberal senator who everybody should defend, and a lot of people more your age went ballistic. And even when Jane Meyer wrote that piece defending him, they were screaming bloody murder about that. Do you think, and they scream bloody murder about Bill Clinton today, though there are things I like about him, if they're going to scream about Bill Clinton, they ought to scream about John Kennedy. Do you think there's just a split among generations on forgiving things? 'Cause I don't think Franken did it. I think Franken was railroaded, just to let you know.
So I think, I don't know enough to say whether Franken was railroaded or not. I think that what you are seeing is sort of a recognition among Democrats, young Democrats in particular, that like we live in a time of false equivalence, right? And so even so allowing so that Democrats would not be able to effectively criticize Donald Trump for assaulting 40 women, or however many have come forward saying that he assaulted them, if they stood by Al Franken when women came forward to accuse him of inappropriate touching. So it's almost, and this is, I agree that this is very unfair, but it's almost not as much about whether he did it or not, as much as it is about what this means as a political weapon and how it neuters their other political weapon that they have. I think that Bill Clinton in particular, that Democrats standing by Bill Clinton is a decision that has had ramifications for 25 years. And when I did a lot of reporting with right before 2016 and after Access Hollywood came out, I went around and I talked to moderate Republican women who were feminists and who, said that they were engaged with women's issues, and I talked to them about the Access Hollywood tape. And the gist of what they said to me was like, well, the Democrats guy got away with it, so our guy's going to get away with it too. What about Bill Clinton? What about Bill Clinton? He got away with it. He didn't get impeached, or he didn't get removed. Like, how come the Democrats guy gets to, have sex with an intern, but our guy doesn't? And so that's where I think a lot of this purity politics, if that's what you want to call it, comes from, because these things, like, if I promise you Donald Trump would not be president without Bill Clinton. I promise you.
That's a good point.
I think that the reaction that I heard from moderate Republicans who do not like Trump, who were not excited to vote for Trump, that what they said to me was, how come the rules have changed when it's our guy? How, oh, suddenly now everybody's so obsessed with this, but like they were fine when it was Bill Clinton? Oh, how convenient. So I think that it gets back to this question of forgiveness. Yeah. I think the flip side of forgiveness is getting away with it. Like, who gets to get away with it? And what is it that they're getting away with? So that's a good question, though.
If I could just add, I think that's a great point that Clinton paving the way in that regard. But also I just feel as though with the Franken case, maybe I'm not remembering it completely correctly, but I felt like a lot of the pressure was within Congress for him rather than from,
It wasn't even a lot of, I didn't see a big movement of people demanding that it was his colleagues.
Yeah, I don't think that was like a Twitter mob moment,
I just know that a lot of writers of your generations, people like, I guess, Ezra Klein, I don't know how old he is, but they were saying, no, this guy's got to go, he's really bad. So, and I'm going, oh, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
Okay.
I thank you both for a provocative conversation. Here's my question. Charlotte, you said after Trump got elected, many people in your generation felt, well, this is the crumbling of the old order, and yet McConnell. So where does Mitch McConnell, going back into the old order of Obama, dragging the Senate to a halt, essentially, from a partisan perspective, fit into that scheme?
Well, McConnell's hung on for a long time. I mean, it's a good question. Again, I don't think this is a wholesale crumbling. Clearly there are still many, many people who are still in power, who are, I mean, Mitch McConnell, I forget the year he was born, but I know that when he graduated from college, it cost $360, his tuition.
Plenty of people who are perfectly honorable who were born then
Of course, but the point is that people get into power and then they stay there and they hold on, and that's one thing that honestly, when you ask about Mitch McConnell, the thing that comes to mind is actually I think the one big problem, one of many problems that millennials have, particularly millennial progressives, is that what Mitch McConnell understands is that only winning is winning. And that there's no such thing as a noble loss, and we changed the conversation, and we raised awareness, and all this stuff. And millennials love to tell themselves that all of these other outcomes besides winning counts as winning. And it comes, I think it's very connected to trophies and stuff like that. But you see, particularly among millennial progressives, they'll run a really progressive candidate, and then it'll be they'll have make incredible speeches about justice and progressive values, and then they'll lose, and then it'll be still a win because we changed the conversation. But and that's something that Mitch McConnell understands that that's bullshit in a way that I think many people in the Bernie Sanders movement need to take a page from his book in that sense, because there is still too much comfort among particularly the millennial left with losing, we lost but we were right. And I think that they don't quite understand that only winning is winning.
In another way, it kind of proves the thesis of your book that he's done so much meddling with the Constitution, because something has to be done from their perspective, faced with this kind of demographic change and generational change.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I do apologize that I haven't read your book yet, but you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm really, I'm intrigued by some of your claims that you've given today. But I'm wondering if you can speak to what I think is a gap in this conversation, which is where Gen X fits into this. Because so many Gen Xers were parented by boomers who went on to parent millennials. So the kind of easy gap between the boomers and the millennials, I think, misses a whole generation of people who grew up and have been labeled as the most disaffected, disenchanted by being raised by a boomer generation, who then went on to parent millennials. So where that fits into your analysis?
So that's a fantastic question. At a certain point, I had to make a decision that I was writing a book about one thing and not another, and so I don't address Gen X in this book very often, and I kind of explain in the introduction why that is, and the short answer is that I could only do one thing at a time. And it's a whole, it would mean analyzing 40 years of events rather than 20 years of events, so I just kind of had to pick my battles a little bit. But you're absolutely right, and I think it would be a fascinating book. Yeah, I would read it. To examine Gen X in this same context, I would love to read that book. I also think that Gen X, just in terms of political power, Gen X just is smaller. There are just fewer Gen Xers than there are millennials, which is one reason why it might feel like millennials are kind of out, taking over and, leaving Gen Xers kind of unacknowledged. There just are more of them. But I totally agree with you that it's very worthwhile. It's a very worthwhile thing to examine, and I want someone to do it so I can read it.
Thank you.
I think that okay, he's got it.
Very interesting conversation. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I don't need this. Use the microphone. Okay, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I have a very simple question. In an audience such as this, and before I came, I thought maybe there would be a couple of dozen millennials. I'm not sure there are or aren't. But will millennials vote? Will they come out en masse and vote? We know that we do.
Yeah.
Okay? I'll bet 98% of the people in this room vote. Okay?
Yeah.
Will they come out and vote?
I think that's a great question. I have there's a couple ways to answer it. One is that millennial turnout did double. So you're completely right to ask that question because millennials have historically sucked at voting and it sucks. Millennial turnout did double in 2018 from 2014. And then 60% of millennials now say that they will definitely vote in 2020, which is way up from previous numbers. But you're right to be worried, because one of the many unintended consequences of Obama being like such a transformative figure for so many of these young people is that many young people think that they only will vote for somebody that they totally believe in and that they're completely enamored by, who completely represents them. And they have a really hard time with the hold the nose, vote for the lesser of two evil kind of vote. And that is not great. That's not a great trait for building political power, but what it means for this election coming up is that the biggest risk Democrats could take would be to nominate somebody who doesn't, somebody who is like an anathema to what these young people believe in, because they will not vote for somebody like Michael Bloomberg.
Yeah.
They will not. And it's because, like everything I said earlier, again, this is a generation where they've seen the power that money in politics has, and they think that it is poisonous and awful for democracy. And this actually reminds me of something that Ben Shapiro, who is a very smart conservative thinker who's been very mean to me online, but he made this very smart point about the difference between younger and older Republicans in their attitudes towards Trump, which is that older Republicans were much more likely to say, you know what, he's like, yes, he might have assaulted these women, or yes, he says these horrible things about people of color, or yes, he's like, tweeting in all these ways, but, he's our guy, and like, we just need to win right now. And younger Republicans are a little bit more worried about what Trump would mean for their futures. They know that they're going to be around for 40 more years and are going to have to answer for Trump in 40 years. And that's why you see Republicans like Dan Crenshaw, who's one of my characters, he doesn't talk about Trump in his speeches. He goes out of his, even though he defends him all the time on Twitter, he goes out of his way never to mention Trump in his speeches because he doesn't want there to be a video clip of him talking about Donald Trump that will be played in a Democratic ad in 2030 or something. So I think that we're seeing something really similar like that right now in the Democratic Party around somebody like Michael Bloomberg, where older Democrats are like, we just need to win, like we don't care what his problems are, like just say he can win. And younger Democrats are a little bit more like, actually, let's think about what this means for democracy.
Right.
What does this mean for democracy that the only person who can win an election is somebody who's a billionaire?
And a Republican.
And a Republican, and who created stop and frisk, which is a racist policy that really harmed young people of color in New York City. So I hope that answers your question. The answer is I don't know. If I had a crystal ball, I'd be so rich. But I don't have a crystal ball. So.
Hello. I'm going to ask a left-handed question because I am left-handed. I'd like to go up 30,000 feet. I'm hearing like the boomers are thesis. Anything that follows is antithesis. And I'm wondering, when we come to the end of all of this, are we synthesizing? Are some things coming that are valuable from the boomer cognizance into what's happening now?
I don't know. I don't know. That's a really good question that I just don't know the answer to.
I mean, I think you address it a little bit talking about the way this generation was raised, and that was a very, has instilled this generation with certain values that maybe were less in evidence in politics before, and now might be kind of flowering in a certain way, holding people accountable.
Yeah.
And
I'm afraid this is going to be our last question because we're running out of time. So let's continue the political discussion later, afterwards.
What movements or tactics are motivating millennials to get out and vote?
The Bernie Sanders movement is. And, you can slice that any way you want it, but young people are coming out to vote for him in huge numbers. I saw a poll the other day that said that 53% of young Democrats support Sanders and 17% support Warren, which means that 70% of young Democrats support one of the two progressive candidates in this race. So, you know, one way to look at this is that, you know, I think sometimes the question is, will young people suck it up and vote for the moderate candidate? And I think in this election, the question might be, will older moderates suck it up and vote for the progressive candidate? Because that's what the direction is looking like.
We hope that happens. Well, thank you for this absolutely fantastic
Thank
book,
you
Charlotte.
for-
Everybody buy it and read it. And
Thank you, Julian.